The mansion of Alexander Veyron stood like a fortress of glass and steel, a symbol of untouchable power. People whispered his name in boardrooms and stock exchanges, calling him the fearsome billionaire who built empires with nothing more than his cold stare and ruthless precision. Yet within the tall walls of his estate, where silence was broken only by the echo of polished shoes on marble floors, Alexander often carried a weight no one saw, the crushing solitude of a man who had conquered everything but peace. That evening, the mansion was alive with guests. Crystal chandeliers spilled light across a ballroom filled with the elite, politicians, investors, aristocrats. Laughter blended with the music of a string quartet, but Alexander remained a distant figure at the edge of the room, glass in hand, his gaze detached. His reputation had been crafted from iron. He was a man no one approached without trembling. Among the staff who moved like shadows was Elena, a maid assigned to serve drinks and clear plates without being noticed. She was used to invisibility, used to the way the wealthy never let their eyes fall on someone like her. Yet as the orchestra shifted to a waltz, a current stirred within her. She had once dreamed of being a dancer, long before life had forced her into service. For a fleeting moment, her body responded to the music, her steps subtle, delicate. A dance meant only for herself. No one noticed, except him. Alexander's sharp eyes caught the movement across the crowded room. The sway of her body, the grace in a simple motion meant only to survive the night, struck something deep within him. For the first time in years, his breath faltered. A maid's quiet dance had pierced the armor of a billionaire feared by all. Alexander could not tear his eyes away. The room around him blurred. The glittering gowns, the polished laughter, the endless parade of guests who came to flatter and scheme, all of it dissolved into silence against the quiet rhythm of her movement. Elena, unaware she was being watched, moved lightly as if each step belonged to another life, one where music and grace had meaning. He had seen prima ballerinas in Paris, celebrated artists on world stages, but none of them carried what she did in that fleeting moment, purity untouched by the hunger for recognition. It was raw, untrained, yet profoundly beautiful. His hand tightened around his glass, a rare tremor running through his veins. For a man whose empire rested on control, losing even a second of composure was foreign, dangerous. At that very moment, two investors approached him with rehearsed smiles. They began speaking of numbers, mergers, opportunities. He nodded absently, his body present, but his focus irrevocably stolen. He found himself stealing glances over their shoulders, seeking her again in the crowd. She had stopped, returning to her duty, balancing a tray of empty glasses as though nothing had happened. But Alexander knew it had. Something inside him had shifted. Later, as the evening dragged on, he caught her again near the edge of the hall, carefully stacking plates, trying not to meet the eyes of those around her. He saw the faint blush of exertion on her cheeks, the humility in her posture. He wondered, who was she before the uniform, before the silence demanded by her position? The orchestra swelled, yet Alexander heard only the echo of her quiet dance. And for the first time in a long while, he realized he wanted to know more than her name. The night deepened, and the mansion seemed to grow heavier with the weight of conversations about power and profit. Alexander drifted through the ballroom like a lion among gazelles, his presence commanding respect, fear, and admiration. Yet his gaze betrayed him. It returned again and again to the maid with the quiet steps and the hidden fire. Elena felt it, though she did not dare look. She sensed his eyes on her, sharp and burning, and it unsettled her heart. For years she had trained herself to vanish, to be a shadow among the rich. She knew that to attract attention in this world was dangerous. Still, her body remembered the music. Her soul, long caged, had dared to show itself for only a moment. And now the most dangerous man in the room had noticed. Near midnight, Alexander excused himself from yet another circle of sycophants and crossed the marble floor with purpose. Conversations quieted as guests followed him with their eyes. He rarely moved among them without reason. Each step seemed to echo until he stopped just a few feet from where Eleanor was gathering silverware. She froze, feeling the weight of his presence like a storm at her back. "Leave it," his voice cut low, commanding yet strangely soft. She turned, her hands trembling slightly, and found his eyes fixed on her with unnerving intensity. For a moment, time fractured. The billionaire, feared for his power, respected for his cruelty, stood face to face with the invisible Maid. Around them, the hall still glittered, music still played, but to Alexander and Elena, nothing else existed. He said nothing more. Instead, he studied her with a gaze that spoke of questions he could not yet put into words. And she, caught between fear and defiance, wondered why her simple dance had disturbed the untouchable man. Eleanor lowered her eyes quickly, trying to shrink back into invisibility, but Alexander's presence was overwhelming. No guest dared interrupt them. No servant dared move between them. The billionaire's silence was louder than any command. He watched her, not as he watched rivals or business prey, but as though he were measuring something inside himself, something that unsettled him. "You danced," he finally said, his words almost foreign on his tongue. It was not an accusation nor praise, but a simple truth spoken aloud. Elena's heart raced. She wanted to deny it, to insist she was only walking, only moving as the music played. Yet the honesty in his gaze seemed to strip away her defenses. "Yes," she whispered, so soft she thought the sound would vanish before reaching him. Alexander's jaw tightened. He was not a man who allowed emotions to surface, but the admission struck him deeper than expected. For years, he had surrounded himself with spectacle, luxury, art, performances crafted for him alone. And yet none of them lingered in his mind, as this did. A Maid's simple dance, fragile and real, had torn a seam in his carefully constructed armor. "Don't hide it again," he said, surprising even himself. The words were more a command to her than a plea, but also a confession to himself. He did not want that spark extinguished. Elena's chest rose and fell quickly. She lowered her tray and backed away with a bow, returning to her duties before the weight of his gaze consumed her. But Alexander remained where he stood, his glass untouched, his thoughts unraveling. In a mansion full of gold and power, he realized the most valuable thing he had witnessed that night was the fragile beauty of a maid, daring to remember who she once was. The guests began to leave in waves, their carriages and black cars lined up outside the gates of the estate. Laughter drifted away into the night, leaving behind the echo of footsteps and the faint scent of expensive perfume. For Alexander, the evening had ended long before the last handshake. His mind was fixed on something far from numbers and alliances. Elena remained in the ballroom, helping other staff clear tables and polish silver. She moved quickly, eager to finish before exhaustion claimed her. Yet each time she caught her reflection in the tall mirrors that lined the hall, she saw more than her uniform. For the first time in years, she saw a girl who had once danced under moonlight in village festivals, dreaming of stages she would never reach. That brief moment earlier had awakened a piece of her soul she thought was buried. From the shadows of the staircase, Alexander watched. He had no reason to linger, no business to justify his presence, yet he remained. Every movement of hers seemed to carry a quiet defiance, as though she refused to let her spirit be entirely consumed by servitude. He envied it. For all his wealth, he could not remember the last time he moved without calculation. When she finally gathered her things to leave, their eyes met once more. This time there was no crowd, no orchestra, only silence. Alexander took a step forward, his voice low but steady. "What is your name?" Elena hesitated. No billionaire had ever asked her that before. For a moment she considered silence, but something in his eyes compelled her honesty. "Elena," she whispered. The name settled in his mind like a spark in the dark, refusing to fade. "Elena." Alexander repeated the name quietly, as though testing the way it tasted in his mouth. He was a man used to names carrying weight, names of companies, of powerful men, of deals that shifted economies. But her name carried no empire, no currency, no power. And yet it lingered in him longer than all the rest. Elena lowered her gaze, clutching her worn coat to her chest. She wished the floor would swallow her whole. A billionaire remembering a maid's name was not a gift. It was a dangerous mark. Attention from him could change her life, but it could just as easily destroy it. "I'll remember it," he said simply, before turning away. His words carried no promise, no explanation, only certainty. That night, long after the ballroom was empty and the mansion silent, Alexander found himself pacing in his study. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the windows, yet all he could see was the flicker of her dance, the subtle grace hidden behind humility. He poured himself a drink, but it remained untouched as he stood at the window, his thoughts restless. Why her? Why now? He had faced titans of industry without flinching, yet the memory of a maid had undone his composure. Across town, Elena sat in her small rented room, peeling off her uniform and folding it neatly on the chair. She stared at her reflection in a cracked mirror. Tonight had been different. She had felt alive, even if only for a heartbeat. But his eyes, the way he looked at her, unsettled her. It was not lust alone. There had been curiosity, almost recognition. Two worlds, impossibly apart, had collided in silence. Neither of them could yet admit it, but the simple dance had already changed their destinies. The following morning, the mansion resumed its rhythm of discipline and silence. Servants moved like clockwork, polishing, arranging, preparing for another day in the house of a man who seemed beyond reach. Yet for Elena, every corridor felt heavier. She kept her head bowed, carrying trays, avoiding glances, but inside her mind, fragments of the previous night replayed again and again. His voice repeating her name, his eyes that refused to look away. Alexander, however, had already broken his routine. Normally, his mornings began with a strict schedule, calls to distant boardrooms, reports of markets opening in London and Tokyo, strategies written with precision. But today he abandoned the first two meetings, to the shock of his assistants. He sat in silence in the library, a place he rarely visited in daylight, surrounded by shelves filled with books he had never touched. His thoughts betrayed him, circling around Elena. He remembered the fear in her eyes when he spoke, the restraint in her voice when she whispered her name. She was not a woman chasing his wealth, not one of the many faces painted in ambition that crossed his path daily. She was something else, something real, and for a man who had spent years building walls of iron, that reality was more dangerous than any rival. By noon, he found himself wandering into the lower halls of the mansion, a place he never had reason to go. Staff froze when they saw him. Alexander Veyron never walked among them, until now. His gaze scanned the corridor until it landed on her. Eleanor looked up in shock, a tray in her hands. The world seemed to still around them. Alexander's voice broke the silence, measured but undeniable. "Walk with me." The command was simple, yet it felt like the opening of a door neither of them could ever close again. Eleanor's grip tightened on the tray. The words hung in the air like an impossible challenge. "Walk with me." No one had ever spoken to her that way, not with authority that demanded obedience, but with a strange invitation hidden behind the command. She glanced around, and the other servants quickly lowered their eyes, pretending not to hear. The weight of his presence made silence a shield. Her legs trembled as she set the tray aside. Every instinct told her to refuse, to stay invisible, but some force beyond reason pushed her forward. She followed him down the long marble corridor, her soft steps echoing faintly behind his confident stride. They moved past towering portraits and gilded mirrors until he stopped at a glass door leading to the gardens. With a flick of his hand, he opened it, and the two stepped outside into the crisp daylight. The gardens were a world apart from the cold grandeur of the mansion. Roses climbed trellises, fountains murmured softly, and trimmed hedges lined winding paths. For a moment, Alexander seemed less like the billionaire feared by nations, and more like a man searching for something he could not name. He slowed his pace, finally turning to her. "You carry yourself like someone who was not meant to bow," he said, his eyes fixed on hers. The statement struck Elena deeply, though she tried to mask it. "I am a maid," she replied carefully, her voice firm despite her racing heart. "That is what I am meant to be." But Alexander only studied her more intently, as though her words were nothing but a fragile veil. "No," he murmured, almost to himself, "you are something more." The certainty in his tone unsettled her, because for the first time in years, she wondered if he might be right. The path curved through the garden, and the air carried the faint scent of roses. Elena walked a step behind him, unsure if she should speak, unsure if she even dared. Alexander, usually a fortress of silence, seemed restless, as though his mind was at war with itself. He stopped near the fountain, its waters catching the sunlight, and turned to her again. "You danced," he said once more, but this time there was no question in his tone. It was a truth he was unwilling to let fade. His voice softened, stripped of the sharpness that usually made men flinch. "Why?" The question pierced Elena. She searched for an answer, her hands twisting nervously. "Because, for a moment, I forgot myself," she admitted, her voice trembling. "The music reminded me of who I once was." She lowered her gaze, ashamed of the confession, afraid he might mock her foolishness. But Alexander did not laugh. Instead, he studied her with the same focus he gave to his most delicate negotiations. For a man who crushed competitors without mercy, her honesty struck him with disarming force. "You should not have to forget yourself," he said, almost against his own nature. The words startled him as much as they did her. For years he had told himself people were tools, pawns, pieces on a board. Yet before him stood someone who was not playing any game. Elena shook her head. "Dreams don't belong to people like me. They only make the work harder." For the first time in years, Alexander felt his carefully ordered world tilt. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but he realized he didn't yet know how. And in that silence, as the fountain whispered, he understood. Her dance had not been a mistake. It had been a revelation. The sound of the fountain filled the silence between them, a rhythm that seemed to echo the tension in the air. Alexander's gaze lingered on Eleanor longer than he intended, his usually sharp eyes softened by something unfamiliar. For years, people had looked at him with fear, envy, or ambition. But she looked at him with none of those things. She looked at him as though he was simply a man, stripped of his empire. Elena shifted uncomfortably, aware of the intensity of his stare. She wanted to retreat, to vanish into the safety of obscurity, yet her feet refused to move. Something in his presence, both heavy and strangely fragile, rooted her in place. "You think dreams don't belong to you," he finally said, his voice low, steady. "But they do. You danced as if the world itself could not take it from you." Her lips parted, but no words came. She had lived her whole life told that servants were meant to serve, that dreams were luxuries for others. And yet, standing before the most powerful man she had ever seen, his words made her chest ache with something dangerously close to hope. "I don't understand why this matters to you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alexander took a step closer, his shadow falling over her in the garden's light. "Because in a world where everything is calculated, controlled, bought, you gave me something I couldn't command." His jaw tightened, as though admitting it was a weakness. "And that unsettles me." The confession hung in the air, heavier than any contract he had ever signed. Elena felt the ground shift beneath her. She was no longer just a maid in the mansion of a billionaire. She had become the only person who dared remind him he was human. The garden seemed to shrink around them, the world narrowing until there was only the sound of water and the unspoken tension between two people who should never have met this way. Elena's heart pounded as she tried to steady her breath. She knew the danger of proximity to power. She had seen others lose themselves in it, crushed when they overstepped. And yet, something in his words had carved into her like truth. Alexander studied her in silence, searching her face for something he could not name. He had built skyscrapers, bought companies, and dictated the futures of entire industries, but in this moment he realized he had no control at all. Not over her. Not over the way her eyes carried both fear and defiance. "Do you always hide?" he asked finally, his tone stripped of cruelty. Her lips trembled before she answered. "Hiding keeps me safe." "Safe from what?" "From being noticed. When you are noticed, people expect, demand, and eventually take everything from you." Her words fell like a confession she had never spoken aloud. She hugged her arms around herself as though shielding her past from his reach. Alexander felt the weight of her answer. He knew what it meant to have everything taken, though in his case, he had fought back with claws and teeth until no one dared challenge him. But her strength was different. It was not forged in domination, but in survival. He took another step closer, the faint scent of roses drifting between them. "I see you," he said simply. The words struck deeper than he intended. Eleanor's breath caught, her body frozen. For a woman who had spent her life being invisible, those 3 words were both terrifying and profoundly beautiful. The world seemed to still after those words. "I see you." Eleanor felt them sink into her skin, deeper than any compliment or cruel remark she had ever received. She had spent her life blending into the background, erasing her presence so others could shine. Now, for the first time, someone with power enough to own nations had looked beyond her uniform, beyond her silence, and claimed to truly see her. Her throat tightened. "You shouldn't," she whispered, almost pleading. "It will only cause trouble for you and for me." Alexander tilted his head, his eyes narrowing with quiet intensity. Trouble had never stopped him before. He thrived on battles others feared to fight. Yet this was not about conquest. It was about the unsettling realization that for once, something mattered without logic or strategy. "I decide what trouble is worth," he replied, his voice steady. Elena turned her face away, staring at the fountain so he would not see the tears forming in her eyes. She hated them. Tears were weakness, and weakness had no place in her life. But being seen, truly seen, stripped away the armor she had worn for years. "I am no one," she insisted softly, clinging to the last defense she had. Alexander's expression hardened, not with cruelty, but with certainty. "You are Elena," he said, as though her name alone was enough to dismantle her protest. The sound of it on his lips carried a weight she could not fight. She drew in a sharp breath, unable to speak. For Alexander, accustomed to owning everything, this was not ownership. It was recognition. And for Elena, it was the most dangerous gift she had ever been given. The garden lay quiet, the fountain whispering as though it alone bore witness to a moment that neither of them fully understood. Eleanor's chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm, her heart torn between fear and the strange warmth his words ignited inside her. She wanted to step back, to retreat into the safety of invisibility, yet her feet refused to move. Alexander stood still, watching her as if she were the only truth left in his empire of illusions. In boardrooms and courts, he commanded obedience with a glance, but here, before a maid whose simple dance had shattered his walls, he felt disarmed. It was not power that bound her to him in this moment. It was something far older, more fragile, more human. "You don't belong to the shadows," he said quietly, "and I will not let you believe otherwise." Elena shook her head, torn between disbelief and the dangerous pull of hope. "And if the world tears me apart for it?" she whispered. "Then let it tear me first," Alexander replied, his voice carrying the weight of a vow. Silence stretched between them, yet it was no longer empty. For the first time, Elena did not feel invisible. She felt seen, not as a maid, not as a servant, but as a woman who had dared to dance when the world demanded her silence. And Alexander, the fearsome billionaire untouched by weakness, realized he was no longer watching a simple maid. He was watching the beginning of his own undoing, an undoing he no longer feared. Their story had only just begun. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. If it touched your heart, write in the comments where in the world you are listening from. We would love to know.